nerds, welcome back. Do you like comics that leave you confused? You don't know what to think about them, how they make you feel. Well, that's good, because today we're talking about the Ultimates. Let's get some nerd how. Today we're going to talk about the Ultimates. They are written by Mark Millar and drawn by Brian Hitch. So this is the Ultimates Volume 1 and the Ultimates Volume 2, and I'm going to talk about them both just together because they comprise the entirety of Mark Millar and Brian Hitch's run on this series together. This series was hard for me to nail down opinions about. When I say that I didn't really enjoy these, it's for one very specific reason. So I am going to go through like all the things that I really liked about these and then sort of tell you at the end what really kind of made it so these didn't end up being the comics for me. Okay, so what you need to know about the Ultimates. The Ultimates is actually a really interesting thing that Marvel did. So as you may or may not know, DC tends to reset their universe with these massive events called crises. And now DC has them almost yearly where they reset all of their books and they sort of give their characters a clean slate and start things over from scratch to like sort of revitalize their world and make it so that their heroes don't get sort of mired down in these continuity bogs. Marvel had not done that for a really long time. And obviously not every event, stays in continuity because some crazy stuff happens in comics, especially in the 90s. But for the most part, they kept their continuity from the beginning all the way through. And they were sort of not sure what to do to like reset their universe. And they actually came up with a really interesting solution to this problem. And it was the Ultimates universe. So they decided to create a universe that was separate from their normal continuity at Marvel. So if you enjoyed classic superheroes and you enjoyed all that continuity that came from like sort of the great history of comic books, you could still jump into like regular Marvel universe. But if you were sort of new to comics and you wanted to jump into something that felt a little bit newer and a little bit fresher, you had at your disposal, the Ultimate Universe. So the whole thought process behind the Ultimate Universe was that it is if superheroes were alive now. So for example, the first series of Ultimate books they released was Ultimate Spider-Man. Instead of being a freelance photographer for a newspaper, which is not really as feasible of a job nowadays, he's like a web developer, right? So the Ultimates is the Ultimate Universe's version of the Avengers. And in the team is Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, Black Widow, Hawkeye, the Hulk, Giant Man, I think his name is, Hank Pym, before he was Ant-Man. Giant Man. Anyway, it's the modern take on the Avengers. What really drew me to pick these up and read them was that this is actually a lot of what Joss Whedon based his Avengers movie on. Like, there's a lot about the way that the team is sort of formed, like, under S.H.I.E.L.D. as, like, this response to, like, crazy things happening in the world. All of that stuff about the Avengers are pretty much drawn from this series. Samuel L. Jackson was sort of fan cast in this book as Nick Fury. And so Sam is like a big nerd and he like saw this, he's like, that's cool. So when they approached him for the movies, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna do that for sure. There is actually an introduction by Joss Whedon at the beginning of the first one. Yeah, at the beginning of the first one where he just like praises Mark Millar for his work in these comics and just says how much he loves them. And you could really tell that there's a lot of stuff in this that later sort of comes to fruition in the Avengers movie. In terms of that, that's really cool about these books, to sort of see how they influence the film and the Marvel Cinematic Universe as like a whole, really making heroes relevant for today. Another thing that I thought was really great was the way in which they updated certain characters for like modern audiences, right? Like, so for people today. Thor, in these books, he is this guy who carries this crazy hammer and claims to be the god of thunder, and everybody around him is like, no, you're not, because that's not possible, and gods don't exist, and you're a little bit crazy. And there's this whole plot with him where people aren't sure if he's mentally unstable or not. Is he the god of thunder, or is he just like a guy with a crazy powerful hammer that's running around helping people? He's also like this sort of intense political activist. He's always like making statements about like, you know, America's like political involvement overseas, and like he's like a massive environmentalist, like all this crazy stuff. And it's actually like a really interesting take on like a hero that is not just somebody who goes around saving people, but that's like politically engaged and like has opinions and shares them. And like what does that mean? What does that look like? Another thing that's really cool is that Iron Man is kind of this modern take on Iron Man. Like his suit is very interesting, and it's not like super slick, and like I kind of think of classic Iron Man, especially like the Iron Man in the films, as being sort of like this Grecian, like an idealized man. And like this Iron Man kind of is like a little bit more weirdly proportioned, because technology maybe doesn't work that way and isn't as sleek as like the Iron Man maybe we're used to from the movies. Maybe his chest cavity is like a lot more bulbous because there's a lot more stuff going on there, right? And the shape of his helmet isn't the shape of like a human face, because this shape is like maybe better for flying and is more aerodynamic. And like when he comes out of the suit, there's like this green like goo that comes off of him that's like a lubricant between him and like the technology of the suit. I don't know, it's just like an interesting take. Another thing that they changed, he has like cancer, like a brain tumor, instead of having like an arc reactor in his chest. And I mean, that's fine. Like if you're gonna change things just to change things, I'm not like super offended by that, but it's also like, whatever. There's a ton of like sort of slightly different choices that they make with these characters that I actually really enjoyed, that I thought were really effective and really interesting and really cool. Another thing that I really liked about this run was that it was non-stop. It kept me reading. Like I read all the way through these pretty quickly, because the action and like the problems that they were facing kept building and kept being interesting, and I needed to know what happened. The plot was really engaging and ended up being really interesting and fun. The art in these is pretty good. Lots of people love Brian Hitch, and honestly, I can see why. He's very competent at what he does. It really fits like the genre of the Ultimates. I wasn't getting confused at all. All the paneling was very clear. For me, it didn't like blow me away with its beauty, but it was perfectly readable and did not detract from the story in any way. Maybe not my cup of tea, but very competent, very good artist. On the surface, I think I would say that this is a very well-written comic. It builds well, the characters are clear, they each sort of serve a purpose within the narrative that is not only very well defined, but also like necessary for the way in which he builds the story. Like it ends up being extremely interesting, the way that these modern takes on classic superheroes have to work with each other and against each other at some points. But I have to say, when this ended and when they won, I wasn't super happy for them. Like, and I think at the end I was like, okay, they won, and that's good, I guess. Like, I'm glad they won instead of the other people that he had built up, and, you know, cool. I'm not sure I want these people to be my heroes. Let me sort of dive into that a little bit deeper. Mark Millar writes a much darker set of characters than I was anticipating or used to. There were some really dark, really twisted personalities on the team. For example, the Hulk, Bruce Banner, he is kind of turned into a kind of the emotional punching bag for everybody around him. But on the other flip side of that, he's not really a super sympathetic character. Like, he's not a good guy. And at one point he turns into the Hulk and is like chasing Betty, I think her name's Betty, his ex-girlfriend, like around the city, and he like says some pretty threatening, creepy, like sexual things to her. And the idea being that like he, as the Hulk, is completely uninhibited and says whatever he thinks, and the Hulk is like a base sort of like animal and like wants to eat and wants to mate, I guess. But it ended up coming off like very dark and creepy. And then another point, Hank Pym, spoilers if you haven't read it, if you want to skip like a couple seconds ahead, but Hank Pym like savagely beats his wife at one point. I want to say that I am not opposed to themes of like sexual and physical and domestic violence in work. I think those are important things that we as a society need to talk about and open up a dialogue about. It didn't feel like that's what this was trying to do. It felt like Mark Millar was saying people are messed up and you shouldn't expect anything else. And like, yeah, there are good people like Thor and Captain America try, and you know, Tony Stark tries, but ultimately they're flawed as well, and nobody does things that are good just to do them. And even if they do, that's really naive of them, because ultimately, like, human nature is twisted. I find that flawed. Yes, there are dark individuals and crazy stuff happens all the time, but I don't think that we should accept that kind of behavior as just par for the core. That was my interpretation of these. It felt like the people who were trying were being made fun of for trying. A moment that really kind of told me this wasn't going to be my book was that Tony is like fighting, and Tony Stark gets like thrown into like a building or something, and he's like really hurt and he's off to the sidelines. And some SHIELD soldiers come up, and Tony is either having an internal monologue or he says out loud, like, I am not a hero, like, I can't do this, who was I kidding, you know, like, I'm just a guy. And one of the soldiers says something along the lines of like, wow, I'm so glad you're here, you're doing what we can't, and I'm so thankful for you being around, thank you for being a hero. And Tony's like sort of bolstered by that, he's like, you're right, it's worth it because I'm doing something that's ultimately good, and I want to be that person, that's who I want to be. And he like flies off back into battle where he's probably gonna die. And the soldier who bolstered him up like turns to his friend and is like, what an ass, better him dying than me, sort of like taking away that moment. That's what I felt like the theme was. There aren't any moments where it's like, wow, you're a hero and that means something, that's something important that needs to be done today. There's a lot of like moral ambiguity with like the decisions of like Nick Fury and lots of heroes on the team and the government. People, except for a few of like the Avengers, aren't really what you would call good people, right? For me, I didn't leave feeling like, okay, like they're flawed, but they're ultimately who I want to be saving my city. I kind of left being like, I don't know, like, I guess it's better than like being enslaved by aliens, but I don't know that I want Tony Stark to be anywhere near me. So I guess would I recommend this to people? I think if you are sort of intrigued by that like moral ambiguity in your superheroes, if you're intrigued by the idea of Avengers being updated for like today and like super interesting takes on these sort of classic heroes, pick it up. It's well written. And I did ultimately I did ultimately enjoy the reading of it. I didn't really feel satisfied at the end. But this is a work that lots of people like. I guess I can understand why. I'm not sure it's my favorite. Alright guys, that was my review on The Ultimates. Have you read The Ultimates? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Also, if you liked this video, I have a few more that you should check out. A like and a subscribe are always appreciated, and as always, stay nerdy.